So this series is called Dividing Jesus Offered Once for All. Well, the reason why I entitled this series Dividing Jesus Offered Once for All is because I really wanted to kind of divide the meanings of Jesus' death on the cross. Because we usually think that the reason why Jesus died on the cross was because he wanted to forgive our sins. Yes, of course, it's true, but in the meaning of the death of Jesus, we have so many other meanings. So that's why I entitled this series Dividing Jesus, who died on the cross as an offering. And he was offered once for all. And this is an attempt to understand, conquer the sanctuary message. So last week we looked at the burnt offering from Adam to Abraham. And today I want to pick up where we were left off last time. So we are going to talk about the burnt offering story from Abraham to the kings. Again, I want to remind you, burnt offering is a sacrifice not for forgiveness of sin, but for establishment of the covenant. And this idea, this concept will keep coming up as we go forward in this series. So that's why I repeat this idea almost every time. So Abraham, when he was called by God to take his son, the only son Isaac, to the Mount Moriah and sacrifice him as a burnt offering, God wanted to test him. Test him what? God wanted to test him if he was willing to sacrifice even his family to obey God's commandments. So through this, the covenant was ratified. Sacrificing Isaac must have been so much harder than sacrificing himself, as we can imagine. Right? I mean, when our kids are sick, we sometimes think that, it would have been better for me to be sick. So sacrificing Isaac, killing Isaac, must have been very, very hard than sacrificing Abraham himself. So in sacrificing Isaac, he must have killed himself first. And he must have wondered, why doesn't God rather ask me to sacrifice myself? Why not me, but my son? Right? It would have been much easier for Abraham to sacrifice himself than to sacrifice his son. So when he was determined to sacrifice his son Isaac, he died, basically. You know, there are a lot of people out there who would rather sacrifice their family than sacrifice their conscience. I'm sure most of you have friends like this around you. You know, even though they have not come into the covenant with God officially or publicly, of course they have not become Christians, so to speak, but if they have this desire, if they have this determination, then I want to say that they have come into the covenant with God. When they can't but have to sacrifice their family, they would rather sacrifice themselves. Well, the sad thing is, the tragic is, this world is telling us that for your wealth, for your fame, for your name, you have to sacrifice your family, not the righteousness, not the right thing. And a lot of people are following that voice. So when we are following that voice, even though we're in the church, we can say that we are not in the covenant with God. We are actually in the covenant with Satan, actually. So in the lamb God prepared, he gave himself. And this is the picture of the atonement. Right? Atonement is transfer of the person who laid the hand on the animal or on the person. right? The atonement is actually a picture of what God would do in Jesus. So, when the burnt offering was offered, sometimes priests had to lay his hand on the burnt offering, not the person. Of course, like common person or leaders or like individually, when people brought burnt offerings, they had to place their hands on the burnt offering. But like daily sacrifice, burnt offering that had to be offered in the morning at 9 o'clock and in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. It was not the people, but the priest had to sacrifice the burnt offering. So he laid his hand on the burnt offering. When I look at this picture, I kind of am reminded of God placing himself, transferring himself to his Son. So the atonement is actually a picture of what God would do in Jesus. So now we're going to move forward to the next stories of burnt offering. Of course, we cannot talk about every single burnt offering in the Bible, but we are going to talk about some like big events. So as God told Abraham in the dream in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham's descendants suffered in a stranger's country for more than 400 years. And when God heard their groaning, Exodus 2, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And he looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Why? Because the children of Israel were part of the promise that God made with Abraham. When God promised this with the lamb that he himself prepared on the Mount Moriah, he made an oath to give the land to the descendants of Abraham with the blood that he prepared. So he was more serious about the covenant than Abraham. Of course, Abraham was serious about it too, and that's why he sacrificed his son, but God was more serious about this covenant. And that's why we ended last week's sermon. It is God that wants to make the covenant with us more than we do. It is God who prepares the burnt offering for the covenant. It is God who acts the duties, the requirements for the covenant on behalf of us. And when God appeared to Moses, this is what God said: I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And the reason why God is appearing to Moses and said this is because God wanted to let Moses know that he is included in the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it is not completely different, separate covenant, but Moses is part of the covenant of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Because in Exodus chapter 17, God said, I will establish my covenant between me and you, Abraham, not only you, between you and me, but your descendants after you in their generations. I will make my covenant. I will establish my covenant between me and your descendants too. But in Genesis chapter 17, God said that for this covenant you have to exercise circumcision. And we sometimes think that circumcision is what Abraham and what the children of Israel had to do for the covenant. But circumcision is not the thing that they had to do. Of course they were required of doing this circumcision. God said every male child among you shall be circumcised. But that was not the only requirement for the covenant, because Moses in Deuteronomy 10 said that, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart. So circumcision that was given in Genesis 17 is a kind of symbol, is a kind of foreshadow of the true circumcision of our heart. And Moses said, Be stiff-necked no longer. Circumcision is a kind of foreshadow of being stiff-necked no longer. In other words, circumcision is a sign of obedience of God's law. So the circumcision of body is a symbol of the heart. So God is being faithful to his promise he made to Abraham by delivering Israelites. Of course, Israelites didn't do anything that they deserved this deliverance. Only because of the promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God was doing this. So he is being faithful to his promise he made to Abraham. So in order to accomplish the promise, he miraculously delivered his descendants. And on the way to the promised land, they met Jethro. And Moses told Jethro all the things that they went through, all the things that God had done for them when God was delivering them from Egypt. So when Jethro heard Moses, everything about how God fulfilled his promise faithfully and delivered the children of Israel miraculously, he was very impressed. You know, Jethro was a priest in Midianite wilderness. He was one serving a God. Of course, not the God of the Bible, not the God of Moses, but he was serving another God. But he was very impressed by what he heard. He must have been moved by what God had done for them. He must not have heard any gods like this before. It must have been the first time that he heard about a God like this. A God being very faithful to his promise. Because at that time, the pagan gods did something on the basis of what people did for God. So that's why the people had to offer their precious things, their valuable things, in order to make God do something for them. So that was the basic idea of gods in the pagan world. But when he heard the story of God of Moses, he was moved because the children of Israel were doing nothing. Like I said, right? They didn't deserve that gift. But only because of the promise that God made to Abraham, God did this. So he was very impressed. He was moved. And this is what Jethro said. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. I believe Jethro didn't say this because of the power that he showed, but because of God's faithfulness. For in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron came with the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. When Jethro took a burnt offering and offered that burnt offering and with other offerings to God, that is an act of making the covenant with God, like we have discussed before, right? Of course, there is no reason not to make covenant with God like this. And that's why Jethro, right after he said, "Oh, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the other gods." And right after, now, there is no reason not to make covenant with God. So he brought the burnt offering and made a covenant with God. So, covenant is mutual agreement. When Jethro came to the decision that he would make the covenant with God, he must have been told about the requirements for the covenant. then he must have agreed to the terms of the covenant. In other words, Moses must have told Jethro all the details of the covenant, all the requirements that God wants Jethro to follow. And even after hearing all the requirements, Jethro said, no problem at all. Still, I want to make the covenant with God. So Jethro offered a burnt offering to make a covenant with God and had a feast. And this is the purpose of God having called Israelites out of Egypt. What is the purpose? As a priest nation, as a priest, to bring all the people of the world back to the covenant with God. Jethro was not aware of the covenant, even though he was in the covenant as soon as he was born. You know, everybody that is born here on earth is actually in the covenant, but they're not aware. They're ignorant of the covenant, and that's why we have to bring people to the realization of the covenant. And this is exactly what Moses and the children of Israel did to Jethro. In Exodus chapter 19, God says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Every nation, every tribe on this earth is mine, but they have gone astray. They don't know what the covenant is. I want them back. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. What's the mission of the priest? What's the purpose of the priest? Priest is a mediator in making the covenant. Right? Of course, priest is a mediator when a nation sins any of God's commandments. Is a mediator. So the reason why the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, was called out of Egypt is because of this task, this mission. And now they finally got to the Mount Sinai to make the covenant. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses says this, the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive. This may sound that God didn't make any covenant with their fathers, with Abraham, of course God made covenant with Abraham, but this is different from those covenants that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I think this is a very common understanding of this verse. People say that, when God made a covenant with Moses and the children of Israel, that covenant is different from the covenants that God made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Well, this seems to be saying that, right? The Lord didn't make this covenant with our fathers. Okay, this doesn't mean it's different from the one made to their fathers. I said this. So, God is not a God of Abraham. God is not a God of Isaac. God is not a God of Jacob. God is God of Moses. God is God of the children of Israel. God is God of you and me. God makes covenant with those people who are alive. We are not supposed to worship the God of Abraham. And also, we are not supposed to worship the God of Isaac or Jacob or Moses or children of Israel. We're supposed to worship God of me. In order for us to worship the God of us, we have to come into the covenant with God now. Jesus said, Matthew 22, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not God of the dead, but of the living. And then God gave the written covenant to Moses, which was the same as the one to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But you may ask this question, because I wondered this for a long time. Why now? What it means is that why is it this time that God gave the written covenant to Moses? Because of this written covenant, because God gave the written 10 commandments to Moses as a written form, because of this, people say that, God didn't give 10 commandments to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the book of Genesis. God could have avoided this argument. We Seventh-day Adventists say that even in the book of Genesis, 10 commandments were given. But a lot of Christians say that, no. 10 commandments were not given in the time of Genesis, but only in Exodus, on the Mount Sinai. Why now? The reason for that is the covenant in Genesis was passed down orally. So oral tradition. Why? Because they didn't have letters at the time. Well, the first mention of recording or writing something down in the Bible appears only in Exodus chapter 17. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua." So the very first mention of the Bible about writing down something. And Bible commentary says this. This is the first mention in the sacred record of writing. The invention of alphabetic writing shortly before the Exodus was much a providential gift of God, as the invention of printing by movable type shortly before the Reformation. Well, alphabetic writing shortly before the Exodus. Linguistics, the scholars, they say that the first alphabet, I'm not talking about English alphabet, but the first alphabet that could write all the sounds that we make in letters. The very first alphabetic writing, the alphabet letters, were invented in Egypt. It is agreed that 1500 BC was around the time the first alphabet was invented. And the Exodus happened 1445, so around 1500. So this is really kind of like providential gift of God. Of course, some people may say that, it's how coincidental, right? But this was a providential gift of God. The reason why the Reformation was able to explode as dramatically as we know is because of the intervention of printing, right? But the Bible could never have become the book of the people. In Korea, when Chinese letters were used, ordinary people were not able to read anything. So when Korean letters were invented, now books could be read by ordinary people. The Bible could never have become the book of the people if it had been necessary to write it in the complicated hieroglyphic or all these like different systems which preceded the invention of alphabetic script. With this new script, with which Moses had probably become acquainted during his long sojourn in Sinai, and also when he was in the wilderness, Midian wilderness, he must have been very accustomed, very acquainted with the writings. It was easy to write the story of God's dealings with his people and various legal regulations found in the Pentateuch as well. It was also easy to learn to read such writings because only like 28-30 letters to combine, to make all the sounds that we make. By no mere accident, the Hebrew scriptures constitute the oldest and most complete historical record of the human race and of God's attempts to rescue man from the kingdom of Satan. So both parties agreed to the terms of the covenant. So when God said, okay, these are the 10 things that you have to obey, and all the detailed informations were given through Moses too. So here, Exodus chapter 24, all the words which the Lord has said we will do, people of Israel said we will obey. Like Jethro said, oh, I will obey all the requirements after he heard. So Moses, in Exodus chapter 24, wrote all the words of the Lord. This is actually the second mention of writing. So Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. And this is called the Book of the Covenant. So he wrote down all the things that he heard from God in a book that was going to be called the Book of the Covenant. In Exodus chapter 31, God gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. So 2 writings in Exodus 24 and 31. Tablets of the covenant is what God wrote. Of course, when God wrote down these 10 things, he must have used the language that they were familiar with. Book of the Covenant is what Moses wrote. So 2 separate things, 2 different things. So tablets of the covenant, 10 commandments were written on the tablets of the covenant God wrote. And the book of the covenant is what Moses wrote. And Satan tries to get rid of the covenant between God and his people. And this is exactly what Satan did to Adam and Eve. When he came to Eve to tempt her, he said, oh, what did God say to you? And Eve said, oh, we are allowed to eat all the trees, but we're not allowed to eat one. So that was the basic covenant, right? Of course, there were many other covenants, but that was one of the covenants that was made between God and Eve, God and humanity. But Satan said, no, that's not true. Even though you eat it, even though you break the covenant, you will be okay. So Satan tries to get rid of the covenant. Through the history of Israel, Satan tries to get rid of the 10 commandments even. So, several times they lost the 10 commandments to some other pagan nations, right? And also, they lost this book. That is the book of the covenant that Moses wrote. Deuteronomy chapter 31, God said, take this book of the law, which Moses wrote, which is called the book of the covenant, and put it beside the ark of the covenant. What was kept inside of the covenant was the 10 commandments, was the tablets of the commandment. But right beside of the covenant, right beside of the ark of the covenant, the book of the law was kept. But they lost this book of the covenant. And the reason why we can say that they lost this book of the covenant is because after a long time, at the time of King Josiah, when they were reconstructing, they were rebuilding the temple, they found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Even though it was in the temple, even though it was in the tabernacle, they lost. And they found the book of the law. And we know this story very well. Josiah, tore his garments, and they came together, all together, and they repented, right? And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the house of the Lord. Doesn't this remind you of any scene that we talked about earlier? When children of Israel made the covenant with God on the Mount Sinai, they heard all the words of the covenant. And then they made a covenant before the Lord. When the King Josiah read all the covenants in the hearing of the people, they made a covenant. And all the people took a stand for the covenant, which means they agreed to the covenant. Basically, they said, we will obey all the covenant, all the commandments, just like children of Israel said at the Mount Sinai. And the next step was to offer the burnt offering. 2 Chronicles, they offered burnt offering on the altar according to the command of King Josiah. We are building up our church. Of course, our church is a church plant, so we are in the process of building up our church. In the process, in the course of time of building up our church, we should find our Book of the Covenant, just like the priest found the Book of the Covenant in the temple when they were rebuilding their temple. And we have to make the covenant with God too. What we need for the covenant is the longing desire to follow God's commandments. It is expressed through the burnt offering. It is expressed through the burnt offering that Abraham offered on the Mount Moriah. How? We have to come to God with the heart that we are willing to sacrifice even our family to obey your words. Like I said earlier in the beginning of this sermon, out there, not in the church, a lot of people, they are ready to sacrifice them and their family to stick to what is right. And burnt offering is really the process through which we can really come into the covenant with God. Without the determination, without our longing heart, not longing desire, we cannot come into the covenant with God. It is only when we come into the covenant with God that we feel the need most of Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. I want you to take some time to meditate the meaning, the concept or the idea of the burnt offering, and I want you to try to meditate the experience of Abraham on Mount Moriah. I hope we as a church come into the covenant all together so that we can really restore His church in our hearts and in our area and in this world.